Welcome everyone. My name's Helena Kennedy and I'm the principal here at Mansfield College, and it's my great honour to welcome tonight Harriet Harman to give the first talk in the Mansfield series, which takes place here every Friday night. Harriet is a very old friend of mine. We've known each other since our 20s, and she's gone on to be, I think, one of the most important women in public life in our contemporary world here in Britain. She has played an immense role in creating change for women, and has done so with courage, and has done so sometimes having to take lots of flack and undermining from tabloid newspapers and from silly people on other benches, and she's done so with great charm and great aplomb. She is a solicitor, she's another lawyer, and we met through lawyering. She has been a Labour Party politician since 1982 actually, when she was still very young, and she has, despite all of that, also brought up 3 terrific children and is about to become a grandmother for the first time. She has really dealt with the kind of highs and lows in politics. The great thing was that the shadow cabinet under John Smith recognised that she was a really vital person to bring on board, and she was given a role as Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury in 1992 when he was the leader of the Labour Party. She became Shadow Employment Secretary, then she was Shadow Health Secretary, and she was Shadow Social Security Secretary, and it meant that she got lots of experience in many different areas of politics. And when John Smith was succeeded by Tony Blair, Labour won the election, of course, in 1997 with a landslide, and Harriet was re-elected, of course, in her constituency in Camberwell and Peckham, and she became Secretary of State for Social Security. And she was the first ever Minister for Women, and she served in that role for the following year. She left the cabinet for a period, and then in 2001 she was appointed Solicitor General for England and Wales, and she did that until 2005 when she became Minister of State for Constitutional Affairs. You'll remember the story. Blair resigned in 2007, John Prescott resigned as Deputy Prime Minister, and Harriet ran for the Deputy Leadership election, and I, to some extent, was a great sort of supporter of her in that, going for that role. It was so important to have women at the leadership of the political party. After winning over Secretary of State for Health, Alan Johnson, she won against him, and so she became the deputy leader. Under Gordon Brown, she became leader of the House of Commons. She, in fact, now is the mother of the House, which just means that she's managed to stay longer than anybody else and be more brilliant than most. She became Lord Privy Seal. She remained Minister for Women and Equality, and she was the chair of the Labour Party. So she's filled almost every single role that there could possibly be, apart from being leader or prime minister. And she's going to join the ranks of people like Shirley William, as people will say she's the prime minister that we never had. But Harriet has been particularly important, I think, in the role that she's played in really arguing for equality and arguing for gender equality, most particularly. She has been absolutely resolute in taking up the case of women and women in our society, and all through, not just for women in privileged professional positions, but right through to women in the workforce on the shop floor, and she's been just extraordinary in doing that. So there she is, an extraordinary woman in politics. I hope someday there is going to be a statue of you in Parliament Square. Anyway, over to you, Harriet. It's wonderful to see you here tonight. Thank you for coming.
Thank you. Well, it's really great to see you all here, and it's great to be in Mansfield College, and it's an honour, really, to have been invited by Helena Kennedy. And we both were born in the same year, 1950, and our journeys really have been quite similar, but in parallel fields. And I want to just talk to you a bit about the women's movement and politics and all the change that there's been for women over the last few decades. And I think for those of you who are my age, it will be the story of your lives as well, because there's been such a big change. And for the younger ones of you, it will be a horror story, which you will scarcely believe, but trust me, it is absolutely true. I remember actually, when I first heard about Helena, which was back in the 1970s, because this was at a time, and I'll say a bit more about it as I go through, about the development of the women's movement. And we heard with absolute excitement that in the bar of all places, the pillar of the establishment, where they were all, well off, privately educated, men at the bar, a complete male hierarchy, very, very conservative, very, very difficult to get into, very conventional. That there was this young working class girl from Glasgow, for heaven's sake, and that actually she was not in there to play by the rules, as some very rare women had actually got into the bar, although there were no judges in senior positions who were women, there were virtually no QCs who were women, but there were a few women who had fought their way in, but they'd really fought their way in on the men's terms and survived in the system as it was, whereas news reached us about Helena is that she was getting in there to really change the agenda and to open the law up and to be part of the progressive movement that we were all part of. And that was very exciting. And then, of course, when I met her, and then we worked together throughout the years. And though our backgrounds could hardly have been more different, although we were born in the same year, we were both one of 4 girls from a household where the father went out to work and the mother stayed at home. But aside from that, it couldn't have been more different. You know, Helena's family was in a tenement, I think they call it, in Glasgow, 2 rooms and a kitchen, her father in skilled manual work, whereas my parents were middle class, living in London. But even though we came from incredibly different backgrounds, what happened with the women's movement and progressive movements at that time is it brought people together in a cause. So basically, it didn't matter whether you were from Scotland or West Wales or London or from Cornwall, whatever your background was, it was the cause that we were united in. And our cause was really to change absolutely everything, because it was a time of such stifling conservatism. I mean, at school, there was this hymn, All Things Bright and Beautiful, and part of it was the rich man at his in his castle, the poor man at his gate. And this was the bright and beautiful things. That's order. Wasn't order absolutely wonderful? And this was how order was maintained. And we were not going to put up with this. We thought everything was wrong and that we wanted to change it. And when I was growing up as a girl, as I say, born in the 1950s, the real pinnacle of your ambition was to get a good husband. And once you'd achieved that remarkable ambition, to actually support and serve that husband. And this is obviously what had happened with my mother. Very unusually, she had actually gone to university. I seem to have left my watch behind. Pass me while I watch Helena, or I might, spend too long. My mother's 99, so I don't want to take too long, 99 years going through this. So basically, she was at Oxford doing law. There were 3 women in her whole year in the entirety of Oxford doing law. It was very unusual to be a woman and at Oxford at all. And the criminal law lecturer wouldn't teach the women. He thought it was absolutely outrageous, so they had to bring somebody down from London. She qualified as a barrister, but once she'd achieved the remarkable ambition of marrying my father, which was, of course, a higher calling than being called to the bar, she gave up because the most important thing was to be cooking my dad's dinner and getting his breakfast on the table to see him off to work. And I look back now and remember that her wig and gown was in our dressing up box. And it didn't really strike me at the time, but that's a very poignant thing. But the women's movement challenged all of that. It challenged the notion of the idea of the man being head of the household and the woman being subordinate and there to service him. And I remember one time when I came back from university and my mother had started to retrain as a solicitor because we'd all left home, we were at uni. My mother had started to retrain as a solicitor, but she still obviously had her very important, wifely role. And I remember coming down one morning and my father, who at this point had retired, was sitting there reading the newspaper at the table. And my mother was cooking his breakfast, which was kippers. It was quite a thing about kippers in those days. And with terrible smell. And she was also, because she was going to be at the College of Law during the day, she was cooking his supper because she would need to have the supper on the table. And that was a curry, so there was this appalling smell of the cook. But also she had a law book propped on the back of the cooker. And he was reading the paper. And I looked at that and I remember thinking, that is not for me. And really, that's what all women were thinking. We had got the notion that we were not inferior to men, that we were not going to therefore be subordinate to men. And of course, in those days, there was a marriage vow which you were to obey your husband. And that really meant something, what his word went for it in the household. And I remember my mother saying to me, in a very sort of subversive way, that most people believe that if a man says something, it's more important than what a woman says. And that if a man says a fact, it's more likely to be true than what a woman says. But that she didn't believe that. And this was conveying a very, very subversive thought. But so when I was growing up, though, my parents mostly what was said was education is wasted on a girl. I mean, that's what was said. That it was important for boys to get an education, but education was wasted on a girl. And my parents unusually did think it was important for us girls to get an education so that we wouldn't have to be dependent on a husband or dependent on benefit, that we could financially support ourselves. So we had this idea that we had to get an education, but we had to be quite careful not to get too much education because no man would want a wife who was too clever by half. I don't know whether you remember that expression, too clever by half, because you would not want to outshine your husband. I mean, that would be terrible. No husband would want a wife that would look like she was an equal to him, let alone superior to him. So for us as 4 girls, we had rather mixed messages. We've got to be educated, but not too educated. We've got to be independent, but not so independent it would put off, our important ambition of getting a husband. But the only thing that was really unambiguous about the message as I went off to university was don't get pregnant. Because if you got pregnant, you would have neither the career and the job, nor would you have the husband either. So that was the thing to be avoided. And in those days, the idea was that women were rivals of each other, and there was a whole sort of language about women scratching each other's eyes out. There wasn't, before the women's movement, and in fact one of the things the women's movement did is instigate the idea that women could achieve things by working together with other women, and that women's solidarity would be what would make change for all women. And so that we'd give up the notion that we'd all be rivals in pursuit of the best husband, and we would work together for social change for all women. And I'll give you an example of how this sense of women being rivals obtained, is that my sister, who also trained as a solicitor, when she was applying for her first job after she'd qualified, and in those days the Law Society Gazette would advertise for men, you know, the right man for the job. This was prior to the Sex Discrimination Act, so you could openly advertise men's rates and women's rates and for the job, and you could also advertise that you wanted a man for the job. Anyway, so she found this one firm near where she lived in Canterbury that she knew had a woman solicitor. So she thought she would ring them up and apply for the job because they had a woman solicitor. She rang them up and applied, and they said, sorry, you can't apply. And she said, why? And they said, because you're a woman. And she said, but you've already got a woman. And they said, yeah, if we had another, you'd only fight. And that was the idea, is that women would be rivals. And the women's movement completely challenged that. The idea that we were not important in the workplace, we were going to challenge that. The idea that we were subservient at home, we were going to challenge that. The idea that the world was one in which men made decisions and women abided by them, we were going to challenge that as well. I mean, at the same time, there was movements about anti-racism, there was movements about tackling homophobia. It was part of that, but a very important part of it. And we had a sense that we weren't going to define ourselves by who we married. We weren't going to be serving the husband. We were going to be on equal terms. That we weren't inferior, so we shouldn't be subordinate. We wouldn't have to be like choosing to be either having a role in the home or a role outside the home, that we would do both. And all the things we were told we couldn't do, well, we were going to do them. And we weren't going to have a situation where actually you have to give up work to get married, because that's often what happened to women. Well, that was the norm. And in fact, I met a woman in Scotland recently, up in Edinburgh, who was in her early 80s, and she told me that she'd done the banking exams when she left school and got a job in a bank. But she had to give it up when she got married, and was very disappointed because she'd only been able to work for a few years before she gave up once she got married. And then her husband died, and when she was in her late 50s, so she went back to work in the bank. But then, unfortunately, they did a whole load of early retirements. So you could see her commitment to banking was only squeezed in at the beginning and at the end of her working life. So the women's movement's determination was to change all of it, to change things in the family, to change things in the workplace, to change things in the law, and to change things in politics. And it wasn't the case that everybody said, what a great idea. This is marvellous. We'd never thought about that before, the idea of women being equal to men in the home. Yes, let's do that. Instead, there was a massive resistance and a massive backlash, because it was challenging the established order. So those of us who argued that there should be childcare for women so they could go out to work, that was an attack on the family, because that was going to lead women to be leaving their children, going out to work. The children would be absolutely destroyed by the experience. It was undermining the role of the father as the breadwinner. So it was utterly regarded as subversive and very dangerous and very, very negative. There was the domestic violence movement at the same time, which Helena played a very leading part in. And that too was regarded as very subversive. Because, you know, it was the man's job to keep his wife in order by a slap if necessary. That was his role. And if it went a bit far and he blacked her eyes and broke her ribs, well, she probably brought it on herself. That's what people used to say. She brought it on herself, or who knows what goes on behind closed doors. So the idea that you would challenge a man in his own household, that he should not be allowed to beat his wife, he was exercising his authority, and that was undermining the family. And as for pushing for women to be on equal terms at work, that was an attack on the notion of the male breadwinner. And at that point, the trade unions negotiated for what was called the family wage. And if the men were not to be getting the family wage, if somehow women were going to be getting equal wages, then it would undermine men at work and bring down wages and frustrate everything that the trade union movement was working for. So actually, arguing for women to have equality at work was also seen as wrong, not only by employers, but also by unions. And I'll give you one example of that. Is a woman called Brenda Clark, working in a munitions factory in Birmingham. And she'd worked there for many, many years and was a member of the Transport and General Workers Union. And she worked part-time, as many women did, and indeed still do. And a redundancy agreement was negotiated between the union, the Transport and General Workers Union, and this munitions factory called Eli Kinnock. And it was last in, first out, which is the normal way of doing it. And in addition, the normal way of doing it was part-time workers out first. And they were, of course, all women. So basically, Brenda Clark wanted to challenge this because this work that these women did, it was important to them. Some of them were lone parents. This was income that was important in their household. They might have worked fewer hours than the men, but their work was as valuable to that company and was important to them. And the idea that a woman who'd been working there for 20 years could be out the door in favour of a man who'd been there only 6 months, she thought that was unfair. And the Sex Discrimination Act had just come into force, and she wanted to challenge it. And she asked her union to challenge it, and they were like, no, we've concluded the agreement. This is the agreement, part-time workers out first. So she wrote to me at what was then the National Council for Civil Liberty, it then became known as Liberty, and asked whether we would take a case. And we took a case under the Sex Discrimination Act. In fact, Stephen Sedley was the barrister on that case. And we had
honorary fellows.
One of our honorary sisters, indeed, as well. He was in those early days. And he acted for us in the tribunal, and we argued that this was indirect sex discrimination. But this caused a real fury amongst the union as well as the management, because they agreed things. This was the way things were done, and we were disrupting. And in fact, we won that case. But you had to sort of take on the establishment. If you were Erin Pizzey setting up Chiswick Women's Aid, which she did, you had to be described as sort of mad and loopy. There was all personal accusations against women who were taking a leading role, and Brenda was regarded as anti-union, which she wasn't. All those women were union members, and I was regarded as anti-union for taking this case, which I certainly wasn't. But it was very much, we had to take on all different parts of the establishment. And in fact, later on, once when I become an MP, the first women went into the fire service in London, and there was 4 of them amongst all the fire brigades in the whole of London. We said put all the 4 women in one fire station, but they wanted to spread them all around. So there was this one woman in the Soho fire station, and they subjected her to an initiation process, which included urinating on her and masturbating in front of her. And one of the lead guys who was doing this got fired by the fire officers, and the union insisted that he be reinstated and petitioned to the GLC, which was run by the Labour at the time, and asked for him to be reinstated, and he was reinstated. And the fire officer, we as women, all rallied round that firewoman. But again, we had to take on the union, the FBU, as well as the Labour Council, and we were regarded as anti-union because it was trying to get this guy sacked when he was an FBU member. Leave aside she was an FBU member as well. And it was regarded as anti-Labour at this point as well, because the GLC was Labour and Margaret Thatcher was attacking the GLC. So for us to be attacking the GLC, well, we must be on Thatcher's side. So it was always very much, a struggle. But we were determined to change things, and we also decided we had to change Parliament. Now, at this point, Parliament was 97% men and 3% women, supposedly representative, but obviously not representative of 50% of the population. And actually, that figure of 3% women was more or less where it had been since the 1950s. It's like, yes, women can vote. Yes, women can be in Parliament, but somehow the glass ceiling is right down there at 3%, and that's your lot. So we decided, just as like Helena was storming into the courts, we would storm into Parliament and just be there and change everything. And as part of that, I got myself selected to be the Labour candidate in Camberwell and Peckham, and thought I would quickly have a baby before the general election so that I could be having the baby before I was elected, and then I could get in there with all the other women who were also selected for Labour seats, and we would all get in there and change everything. But unfortunately, these things never work out quite how it was planned, because sadly, the MP that I was selected to replace died when I was pregnant, and everybody was like, oh, well, you can't be a by-election candidate when you're pregnant. But the whole thing about the women's movement is if anybody said we couldn't do something, well, we were going to do it. So it's like, no, I'm going to be the candidate. And the party locally was very much sort of enthused with the women's movement. So I was elected at about 7 months pregnant. And I remember that moment when I went into the House of Commons through those enormously heavy doors. And in a by-election, you come in, when the House is absolutely jam-packed after questions. There was MPs on all sides. And remember, they were virtually all men, as I say, 97%. And I sort of looked at them and I felt, when you feel very out of place? And the House of Commons was quite old at that point. The average age was well over 50, and I was in my early 30s, and it was all men, as I said. And there they all were in their suits lined up on all these seats, and I just sort of could feel my skin prickling with uncomfortableness, because there was I in my red velvet maternity dress, and I just was very out of place. But I thought, well, it's all right, because there will be loads of women coming in the 1983 general election, and then the sisterhood will all be there and we'll be work together. But unfortunately, Labour did so badly in the 1983 election that actually the sisterhood did not arrive. So I was there
high and dry.
In a very, sorry?
High and dry. You were left to do
High
yourself.
and dry. And when I made suggestions, which were the women's movement suggestions, that we should have more Labour women MPs because we were the party of equality and of women, that was regarded as very offensive to our male colleagues, because it was like criticising them, and they would regard it as a personal attack on them. So even, it's like you're supposed to get in here, keep your head down for 10 years, learn the ropes, and do it like everybody else had done. But that wasn't the way we were going to do it. And I was advised endlessly, don't bang on about women. People will think you're odd. Don't be talking about maternity services. Childcare is not a political issue. You should be talking about the money supply, the mines, and the motorways. That's how you show you know how to be an MP. So it was really a very different agenda that those of us who were in Parliament at that time, which was just me at that point as far as the women's movement was concerned, and Jo Richardson. It was a difficult time. And all the time as well, remember, I'd have a stay-at-home mother myself, and the idea that you could be working and having children was quite a new idea. And when I got elected in '82, I had a whole sack of post when I arrived, which always happens when you're a new MP. Phyllis Starkey, who's here, will remember this. The stack of posts you get when you arrive as a new MP. Anyway, half of it was like, congratulations, that's brilliant, you're in there to do the business of the women's movement and to fight for Labour. At this point, of course, we were absolutely in the depths of opposition. Fantastic, good on you. But half were saying, what are you doing? What are you doing? You will ruin your children. They will truant from school. And I couldn't be sure they weren't right because we didn't have models of people who were actually working outside the home and being committed to their work, but also having children at the same time. So that really hung about me through all the time, was this sense of maternal guilt, is that was I doing a terrible thing by striving in the House of Commons, by going all around the country supporting Labour all around Scotland and Wales, but also having young children. And that was, that was very much a thing at the time, hopefully, with hopefully more men sharing the responsibility for children, then perhaps they can share equally the guilt. I think probably having children, you probably feel guilty anyway, but to have a share of that, I think would be quite important. But outside the House of Commons, although there was very much hostility in the House of Commons to what we were arguing for, outside there was so much support because the women's movement was so cohesive and so strong and so united. And therefore, any time I would be on a bus or on a train or in the street, women would come up to me and say, keep on what you're doing. We know what you're doing. We're trying to do it in our lives, whether it's in education or whether it's in the private sector, or we're trying to do it as well. So keep on what you're doing. So although many times I thought this is impossible to do, because the House of Commons used to start at 2:30 in the afternoon, finish, if we were lucky, at 10 o'clock at night. Often it would go on till 11:30, and not unusually it would go till 1 o'clock in the morning. So it was absolutely exhausting. And many times I wanted to throw in the towel, but I didn't feel I could, because when you've seized the flag of a cause, if I'd have thrown it down and said, I just can't hack it, what with the kids and everything and the hours, then it would be like, see, I told you a woman couldn't do it, and it would set everybody back. So anyway, we argued for more women to come into the House of Commons, and in the Labour Party, we made the argument, and lots of the men started to agree with us, but weirdly, nothing changed. Still, the men were all selected. So we proposed a rule change that there should be no men-only shortlists for selection in Labour constituencies, that we should have at least one woman on a shortlist. Well, you can imagine. The absolute hit the fan. I mean, it was regarded as absolutely outrageous. So we withstood all the arguments, we got that constitutional change, and all the men on the shortlist got selected. No women got selected at all. So we thought, well, this isn't working. We'll go really bold. We'll go half the shortlist has got to be women. Well, absolute riots broke out at that point. But we got that rule changed through. 50% of every shortlist had to be women, and guess what happened? It was the 50% of the men on the shortlist who invariably got selected. So we thought, we have got to get some women into the House of Commons from the Labour Party. We're talking about equality, and it's all men. So we put forward that there should be the women-only shortlists, that in some areas that the constituency party could choose whoever they wanted, so long as it wasn't a man. Well, you can imagine this caused absolute fury and mayhem. And one man said to me, who'd wanted to be an MP, I've moved my wife and kids to this godforsaken dump of a town. The MP is looking really unwell, and now you're saying that I can't even apply. You have ruined my life. And that is literally what was going on. But we pressed on with that because it was the only way to make the change. And the moral of that story is you have to will the means if you want to achieve the end. And sometimes the means will be very uncomfortable. That was very uncomfortable to exclude men from selections. But it was the only way we could make the difference. And so there we got to, in 1997, 100 Labour women MPs, which transformed the look of Parliament, and it transformed the public policy agenda. So, for example, things like childcare. When I started out as an MP, if you beat your children or neglected them, you could get a nursery place because it would protect your children from you. But actually, otherwise, there was no council nursery places. And I had one constituent who'd got a nursery place when she was in difficulty as a lone parent and suffering all sorts of problems. And she came in to see me a few months after I'd helped her get this nursery place. And she was looking great, her hair was all washed and she was all smiling and everything. And I said, "Blimey, you look absolutely great to see you again." And she said, "That's the trouble, that's what they said to me in the nursery. They said, you're great, you look great, you're really back on your feet, so you can't have your nursery place anymore." Because of course it was only there for social services, and we argued that there should be universal provision there to support women at work. So we argued that the laws on domestic violence should change, we argued that maternity pay and leave should be doubled, we argued that there should be paternity leave, we argued for more progress on equal pay, and across the board we made changes which you could have only done if you'd have had a Labour government and also 100 Labour women MPs who were the engine of this change. And an awful lot has changed, and I think that we very much changed the mood and changed the argument. Nobody now would argue that a woman shouldn't get equal pay for a man, nobody should argue a man should hit his wife to keep her in order, or that women are inferior. However, although I think the mood has changed, the reality hasn't sufficiently changed. If you look at some of these moments we've been having recently, look at the Harvey Weinstein case. I mean, we as women all know that the issue of, in a male-dominated hierarchy, most men will not dream of abusing their position by insisting on sex with women lower down in the hierarchy, but some will, and they had absolute impunity. There was no ability to complain. If you did complain, you would just be regarded as a troublemaker and nobody would believe you. And actually, the Harvey Weinstein moment showed what we all knew was going on and was endemic. And actually, it has led, including in the House of Commons, where a Secretary of State's head rolled as a result of this, that there needs to be proper complaint systems, that there needs to be independent adjudication of the complaint, that the complainant, who's invariably more junior in the pecking order, should be able to complain anonymously, and that actually there should be change. If you look at the pay transparency publication that there's been in the last few weeks, what it's shown is what we've always known, that women are paid less than men. And you know, we're not prepared to believe that women in JP Morgan are worth 90% less than the men there. I mean, we're just not prepared to believe that. And now it's all exposed, and therefore there's an opportunity to make that change. If you look at the exposure on the transparency on pay in relation to the BBC, Carrie Gracie, the China political editor, speaking fluent Mandarin, risking arrest and deportation, and being a most brilliant communicator, paid half as much as the American political editor. I mean, our political editor for the BBC in America, totally unjustified. But I think we've got a bit of a way to go to close that gap, because the Director General of the BBC said, firstly they'd said that she didn't get paid as much as John Sokol because she was in development. Well, it's very hard to see how she was in development, and she was justifiably absolutely furious. But then what the Director General said is, well, I can see what we've got to do is we've got to be much clearer about the pecking order. And it's like, no, we're not interested in explanations and justifications and rationalizations. The numbers have got to equalise, because otherwise we're being asked to accept that women are less valuable, are worth less than men. And that echoes back to the idea that there was in the 50s. And if we don't agree with that attitude anymore, we have to change the numbers. And I don't care how they do it, but they've just got to change the numbers. So we're beyond the excuses argument, even the excuses of Ryanair, which has got a 70% pay gap, who said, well, it's obvious why we've got a 70% pay gap, because all the men are the pilots and the women are serving the drinks. So that's why there's a 70% pay gap. Well, actually, there's a global shortage of pilots, so they should do some training of women pilots, and then that would sort their pay gap out as well. So just in conclusion, I'll just say 2 words about the Tory party and women at the moment, because basically the whole drive for women in Parliament came from the Labour Party. The Labour Party became the political wing of the women's movement. But actually, as women advanced in the Labour Party, women in the Conservative Party looked over at us and were like, well, why can we not be in Parliament in our party? So actually, it precipitated opportunities for a lot of Conservative women to get into the House of Commons. Now, that was not one of my objectives of the women's movement. Getting lots of Conservative women is a bit of a paradox. But ironically, a lot of them really are daughters of the women's movement and share a lot of the values that we had. So I do actually tell them they are in the wrong party, but they are in the House of Commons. But I think Theresa May is part of the old school, more like Margaret Thatcher, which is we can show the men, we can beat them at their own game, rather than we're in as a subversive force to change things. But just in conclusion to say that, and looking to the future, because we still have much more progress that we need to make, it is not called a struggle for nothing. It is a struggle to make change. People don't say that's a great idea, we'll make loads of change. They fight back and you get a backlash. And of course with social media, you can see that backlash amplified. And I think we need to call that out for what it is, which is not just random, it is basically silencing women, because if you're young and as a woman and speak up, that's even more objectionable. How dare you? You should be staying at home and keeping quiet. And actually, this backlash is about trying to silence women. The other thing I would say, as a woman trying to bring about change, don't expect to be ragingly popular. And if you are ragingly popular, you're probably not doing anything. And expect to be having a row. And if any time you find yourself not having a row, then you better gear your act up, because you're obviously not doing anything. Next, it's really important to work in solidarity. You cannot achieve things on your own. You have to work in solidarity with other women, and it's also the only way to withstand the misery of the backlash. The next point is, I think, to resist the idea that there's a hierarchy of inequalities. There's so much inequality. It's on grounds of race, it's on social class, it's in relation to disability, it's on sexual orientation. There is so much inequality. And actually, no one inequality, although they've all got different roots and have different things, no one is more or less important than the other. They are all bad. All inequality is bad. And anybody who fights, for example, against inequality of people with disabilities, I wouldn't dream of saying to them, but you haven't fought about equality for women. This, whatever anybody's doing, in any area of inequality, whether it's race or sexual orientation or gender, I would support them doing that, not say, why aren't you doing something else as well? So basically, all of those things need to be fought at. We shouldn't have a hierarchy of inequalities, therefore you are not as important as somebody who's fighting some other inequality because some other inequality is worse. We should all be supporting those who are fighting inequality and be against those who are promulgating and supporting inequality wherever it's found. So no hierarchy of inequalities. Also, there's still a question of work and family, and the mother and the father or the two parents sharing equally. And that is something which the next generation we'll still have to work on. I always ask sixth formers in my constituency, I ask the girls, when you, have a baby, will you expect the parent of your child, your partner, will you expect them to share equally with bringing up the child and, working that round their work? Yes, they all say, yeah, we definitely want to have a partner, which is sharing equally. And then I ask the boys, are you going to be sharing equally? And they're like, no. So it's like, good luck with that one, because there is still a difference, in expectation. The other thing is, I would say, is it's important to do your best not to judge other women and criticise other women, because basically we all get so much criticism all the time that actually it's better, if we can possibly resist it, not to criticise each other, because we're trying to make progress. And finally, I would say, in pressing for equality for women, you are on, however difficult it might find, you are on the right side of history. And that actually today's outrageous unreasonable demand will be tomorrow's conventional wisdom. And the question of gender equality is about modernity. Think of those societies which are rows and rows of men deciding things with women being subordinate. They are the past. So if you fight on women's equality and you do your bit to carry things forward, you'll have a hell of a row, but actually you'll be doing the right thing. So good luck with it.
Great. Harriet, that was wonderful. And I'm sure that there were some things there that for the young seemed unbelievable, and for many of us who are older, it was familiar and it brought things back to mind. I do remember all that nonsense that you had to deal with in Parliament, where we were trying to talk about how language, there's often resistance to these sorts of things, that where language can often be sending out messages to people about the fact that certain jobs are done by men. So you still get it where people sort of say, "Why are you calling yourself the chair of?" They say it to me, "Why are you calling yourself the chair of the Man Booker Foundation? You're a chairwoman, or you're whatever." Or a chairman is a generic term and it includes women. And I say, well, one of the reasons why one chooses to do that is about the way that it's saying to women out there, we too can be heading up organisations and that kind of thing. And we have to find ways of, challenging how language is actually can be exclusionary. And it may seem rather perverse at times, but it's actually about trying to do something about making people think about that. And I remember you being called Harriet Harman.
Harriet Harman, that was the other one.
Yeah. And it was that whole business of the mockery and the kind of ways
you were
in which...
told not to rock the boat.
I was told very loudly that not to rock the boat and at the bar, and that arguing for better ways in which women might progress better, and identifying ways in which there was discrimination in women being given places in chambers. Remember all that stuff? Women couldn't get pupilages, they couldn't get training contracts, they couldn't get moved into, when you'd go and do pupillage, lots of men at the bar, it was all done on an individual basis, so men liked having a young woman as a pupil. But the idea that she'd be taken on in chambers and get a permanent place, that was something else. And often they didn't even champion the young women that they liked being at their elbow as they went to court and going out for lunch with them and stuff. So it was about trying to get a huge bit of change. And at the time, we were all considered to be very difficult women. And that still remains.
Or bonkers, that's the other thing.
Utterly bonkers. There were lots of that thing about being bonkers. And when you look back on it, I want us to remember the ways in which women like Claire Short, for raising the business of page 3, she raised in Parliament the business that why was it that newspapers, we didn't declaim about the fact that women with bare breasts were all over the newspapers, and she was considered to be somewhat terrible prude. She was humiliated in Parliament and elsewhere over raising those issues about what that was doing for women in the workplace. I remember in chambers there being pictures on the wall of those women with the bare breast in the clerk's room. You know, you'd go in to get your brief when you were a pupil, and the walls were covered with breasts, you know, and it was all to humiliate you. I just wanted to also raise the business that when you started in the House, I mean, and until quite recently, I mean, there was all that woofing that went on. Men would, you know, if women stood up to speak, they would sort of, you know, either you would be kind of, noises were made to refer to whether they thought you were attractive or whether you weren't. And there was noise and ghastly stuff that went on to women. I mean, to you and other women. And the business of juggling breasts, men would stand up and do all that kind of thing to women. Has that subsided?
Well, I wouldn't say subsided, because that implies that it's just sort of evolved away. I think it's been really slapped down by Speaker Bercow, who has really not wanted, has been really, really tough on that. But one of the things that that still happens in the House of Commons is if a woman speaks and she's got a high-pitched voice, they sort of go like that, sort of. And actually, women can. What matters is what you say, not the pitch of voice that you have it in, that you say it in, so that there is still jeopardy if you're a woman with a high voice, which is absolutely ridiculous when you come to think about it. Yeah. The register for a political voice is a deep one. I mean, that's why Claire Short was quite lucky. She had quite a deep voice.
Margaret Thatcher had to have, she had elocution in order to
she
lower
brought her voice down
for the same
by
reason.
elocution, which is ridiculous. Why do you have to change your voice? But there's still, but actually there is, and I really thought I would never see the day, and I would be carted out in a box before I would ever see this. There are, in the House of Commons now, not only the daughters of the women's movement, but the sons of the women's movement. There are actually men in the House of Commons who believe that their wife's work is as important as theirs, and that the wife is not there to be the wife of an MP with a bit of a job on the side, that they are actually
or running
partners.
their office, or
or so. And we had a debate recently because we're trying to introduce maternity and paternity leave for MPs for the first time ever. We haven't quite got there yet, but hopefully we will. And there was lots of speeches from men who were saying, I want to play my part in bringing up my children. I owe that to my children. I owe that to my wife. It's not for me to come here and be the big I am and expect her to have delegated responsibilities for the family. I want to play my part. And honestly, I nearly had to be revived from being in a dead faint. It was for real. And when a Conservative MP man got up and said it, honestly, I really was quite beside myself. So I think there's a change amongst the men,
Absolutely.
as well as amongst the women.
We see it at
But it
the
did
bar.
take about 30 years, to be fair. It's been like hard toil.
There used to be a thing where, you know, it was much easier for, I mean, if a woman said, I need this time off because I've got childcare problems, you know, there was a way in which it led to sighing in the courts. And so women never said that, because if you said, my car broke down on the way here, rather than that the person who looks after my children was late, then your car breaking down was a reasonable excuse, but your childcare arrangements had somehow gone awry, was not a reasonable excuse. And it was a sort of interesting thing that I've noticed that amongst lawyers, that young men, I can overhear them talking to other young men about their babies. And I don't think that would have happened in a...
But there is something that goes along with that, which I find extremely irritating, which is that if a woman's in a meeting and they say, I've got to go now because I've got to pick up little Johnny from school, everybody's like, she's not, oh God, she's a bit flaky, she's not committed, you know, can't be doing with that. But then if a man does it, it's like, oh, he's marvellous. He's going to pick Johnny up from school. And he says, I'm sorry, I've got to go now and pick Johnny up from school. And unless everybody's heard, it's then said again, I've got to go and pick Johnny up from school, just so that there can be massive appropriation, approval of this. And actually, I find myself being really annoyed and thinking, do it, don't talk about it. It's a bit like a man cooking a massively complicated curry and leaving every ingredient over the surface and then talking about it for a year afterwards.
You sound as though this is familiar to you.
talking about it for a year afterwards. Meanwhile, the woman is day in, day out producing the food for the family. Is that I think we need a period of grace where men actually do it, but they don't do any virtue signalling on it because they haven't won that right yet. Because there's people like me who are, you know, still in recovery from my life experience, and I don't want them to hear, bearing in mind how difficult it is for women still to say that, for men to say it easily, because when you're at the top of something, you can say things more easily because you are unchallenged, whereas women are still trying to get their way in. So men doing loud speaking about their families, they think that we're all going to go, us women in the women's movement, you're marvellous. We're not, we're furious.
I want to go back to something that you spoke about, which I agree with you, change the whole, the whole temper of politics, which was getting so many more women into Parliament. And that was having the all-women shortlist, which I, too, was a great supporter of. But we met lots of resistance, and not just from men. We met it also from women. It's part of that thing that's out there where you repeatedly hear women saying, and you hear it in the
I want to do it on my own terms.
I don't want there to be quotas. I don't want to be the token woman. You know, all those guys out there who said, no, I don't want to be the token man. I don't want to be, you know, it's deeply infuriating to me to hear this.
I think it's partly, some of the women were worried that if they got selected on an all-women shortlist, they would get the disapproval of people saying, oh, well, they're not any good, they're just from an all-women shortlist. And that was said, oh, these women are hopeless, they all were just selected because they were all-women shortlist. And in fact, when the women came into the House of Commons from the all-women shortlist, you can't now tell the difference between those women who came from all-women shortlists and those who came from open shortlists. I defy anybody.
We don't know.
The quality is such that you can't tell who's from an all-women shortlist and who's from an open shortlist, but you could see women were worried that they somehow might get picked on and called second-rate because newspapers were trumpeting that they were second-rate. And then when we got 100 women in, immediately it was like Blair's babes, immediately belittled, diminished, as if somehow we'd been, you know, assisted. I mean, it was called the Assisted Places Scheme, you know, and that's what annoyed me. I don't know whether anybody saw that play, Labour of Love, is that at the end of it, the man MP decides he's going to step down, and he gives the constituency to his secretary that he's just snogged, of course. And it's like, oh, that is not how you get to be a woman MP. You know, you snog the male MP and then he gives you the constituency. And yet, in this day and age, that is how it's represented. Those women who've got into the House of Commons have all fought their way in, you know, as women in parliaments all around the world have done. There's now women in parliaments from all around the world. And talking to women from parliaments from other countries, you hear all the social resistance there is. I mean, there was, you know, one woman I was talking to from Kenya who was saying, you know, that she doesn't have any problem with, you know, the childcare because her husband is always at home because he doesn't have a peer group. So I was like, I wonder whether there was something lost in translation here. I said, what do you mean he doesn't have a peer group? And she said, because his family have rejected him and all his friends have rejected him because they regard him as not a proper man, because obviously his wife is out of control, otherwise he wouldn't have let her be an MP. So the kind of social thing is, if you're the head of the household, you do not expect to have a wife. It's undignified for you to have a wife who's an MP. And the social resistance and the familial resistance and the fury of the mother-in-laws that you should so belittle her son by becoming an MP.
That's interesting.
You know,
and
it's very
that?
difficult.
Where was that?
That was Kenya.
Very interesting, because there's quite a lot of women in Parliament in Kenya.
There are, and there's women all around Africa surging their way forward. They're still a minority, they're still on the margins, they're still tackling male power structures, but they're really inspirational. And the problems that we face are like absolutely nothing compared to...
But one last question before I take it over to the audience. Do you feel there's a moment of change, real change, as a result of the Harvey Weinstein Me Too business? I mean, do you feel that this is a big breakthrough or not?
I think it is. I think it is, and if the momentum is kept up behind it, same with the pay transparency, these moments can deliver lasting change, but we have to make sure that they do.
Yeah. Now, who would like to ask a question? Come on. Yes, look, hands are going up. More. Good. Gentleman on the left, woman here, please. Thank you.
Listening to you, the first part of your speech, I thought am I in the UK or in India? Because it appeared to be that the way you were describing married life seemed very similar to what the women in India and other third world countries are suffering. Next, the word love simply didn't come out of your mouth. So I think it's rather strange that you describe marriage, all that you suffer, all that women suffer, but there's no equality in your assessment of life. Where is love? Does love come into the marriage, or is marriage a business? And that's one thing. Another thing is, what I'm trying to say is here, you say that equality, two people, two men or two women can never be equal in all aspects. I'm quite surprised that you consider that women should be selected on an all women
shortlist.
This was said when black people were shot in the police force. There was a suggestion that the qualification for entry into the police force should be reduced. We fought that because we don't want secondary education people. You know, I'm trying to find out the sense. All the time that I'm listening here, you were attacking men in every way, in every conceivable way. And last of all, I want to tell you something personal. East Oxford MP is now a lady. They said she was selected, but I put my name forward in time, and somehow or another, the party decided that my application was out of time. Now, what women have suffered here and in the West and in other countries, black people are suffering every day in this country, in the West, and in America as well. So I just think that there should be a sense of proportion when you attack all men, everybody. For example, you're saying about chairman, chairwoman. Now, woman, W-O-M-A-N. Why don't you write to the Oxford University Press and say, drop out the woo, the man, and have woos, and human, you can have whoos, H-U, drop out the man. I also support women, not only in my country, but here as well. It's very, well,
Sir,
I'm not going to make a big speech, but I think you could...
We've got the sense. We've got the sense of your objection and your challenge to our speaker, and a disappointment as a Labour candidate.
Okay.
Anyway.
Okay, so basically, I think that what we were doing is challenging a system which said a man could go to university and then be in his profession, or a man could go out to work and his work would be valued. But if a woman went out to work, like Brenda Clark in her munitions factory, that it was not valuable and it wasn't worthwhile. And that was inequality and discrimination, and that we wanted to challenge that. And that for women like my mother, who'd got all the qualifications, but they couldn't practice as a barrister. So it's the system. It's not about my father as an individual or my mother as an individual. That's the way that the cultural expectations were. So it's not so much an individual thing, but challenging the whole system.
It is right to say that Harriet Harman was describing a world that was 50, 60 years ago when your mother...
And unfair.
70 years ago.
And the fact that there's discrimination on grounds of race, I don't think that should be set against trying to tackle discrimination on grounds of gender or any other, that all discrimination is bad, and therefore we need to press forward on all, which was the point that I made. And as far as black people in the police, I think it's very important, for example, in the Metropolitan Police, that if you've got a police force which is overwhelmingly white, policing an area which is mostly young black people, then it's more difficult for there to be that relationship built up when the police are not seen as somehow opposed to the people in the area, and therefore it's important to have a police force which matches the community they are policing. And that's why we put in the Equality Act the opportunity for positive action, which was not about reducing the qualifications. It was basically saying, if you get a black person and a white person and they both have achieved the level of being okay to be recruited, you've got to reach the level, you can choose the black person in order to improve the ethnic balance in your police force. So that's the way it was. It was about positively choosing the black person, even if they're both equal, but they've both got to have got to the right level.
Well, thank you very much, Harriet. I'm slightly older than you, but I've sort of followed your career, and you've been you are, sorry, none of the past tense, a wonderful role model. In Oxford Labour Party, I'd just like to say that I think every leadership role we have women, including Oxford East MP, who increased substantially the Labour vote in the last election. And so I think that's something to celebrate. So I don't really have a question except to say that this is just another moment in, if you like, the long march of women's movement, and we need to keep going.
We do, and I think next time we need to have, and we're not going to be having a leadership election anytime soon in the Labour Party, but the next time we do, I think we've got to have a woman. The Tories have managed to have not one, but 2 women leaders. It just looks, it's so rude to all the women MPs and all the women members of the party that apparently none of us are up to it. And I think what we've got to do is we've just got to say, we're going to look at all the incredible women that we've got in the House of Commons now and pick from one of them.
Now, Harriet Harman, why didn't you run?
Well, just in
why
terms of
didn't you run? There were times when you could have run.
I think that, I was such an outsider for so long, it's quite difficult to see yourself as a leader of an institution where you've been sort of on the outside for so long. But I think for the future, there's a lot of great men in the Labour Party, and I think it's very easy for men to see themselves as having leadership potential, and for us all to see them as having leadership potential. So when any of our fantastic men do a great speech at the dispatch box and they really, really make out the argument, I say that is a brilliant, brilliant speech. You're a fantastic asset for our party. You're obviously going to really make masses of progress. And I think you should really be as ambitious, you should be ambitious. And I think you could even be deputy. And just encourage the notion that their role is to support a woman leader, not to be the leader themselves. That is the political virtue. And there's Saida Varsi, who is a Tory, but she's also, I think, in the wrong party. She says that it takes a very remarkable man to be a leader, but it takes an even more remarkable man to support a woman leader. And that's what I'm trying to encourage the men in the Labour Party to be that remarkable. So I hope you'll join with that argument that next time there's a contest, we've got to choose from one of the women.
Yes, but it's more complicated, isn't it? Because in every political party you have factions and caucusing, so it's not enough just to put up a woman. There has to be, if you like, a women's caucus that you are pretty certain you're going to get the votes, you're going to get the numbers. And I've worked with trade unions for many years, and it's the same there too. So it's about the politics, the democratic politics of the organisation.
But I think
as
the men
much
have got
as
to
women-
not stand, and then they can have any women from any different faction. But the men have got to show their commitment to women's equality
Yeah, and you've
by,
got-
for once in our century of existence, that they won't put themselves forward. Do you think that will happen?
Can you pass the
I don't know,
microphone forward?
I think the jury's out.
I need to move it around. No, young woman just in front of you. Yeah.
Sorry. Oh, that's loud. I just wanted to ask about, of course, there's lots to do in getting a woman leader and everything, but in terms of sort of policies that the government of whichever party can do you think gender budgeting would be a good step to take in terms of helping women out across the country rather than just in politics?
Gender budgeting, meaning that in looking at the particularly if you're looking at transport, if you're looking at housing or whatever, that you actually have the considerations of women up front, knowing that women often are earning less and so on because of life circumstances and historic disadvantage. What do you think?
Well, I think that at the very least they should do an impact assessment and publish it. And I think one of the things that we've been arguing is that alongside the budget, that there should be a gender impact assessment that shows how any particular tax or spending measure is going to impact on women and on men. And then at least it's out in the open. I think it's very important that things, and that should be done. And in fact, Nikki Morgan, who's the chair of the Treasury Select Committee, is arguing for that. I mean, we've got the OFS, you know, who's independent, who do an analysis of the budget and say how it's going to work in terms of, you know, growth and public spending and the deficit and everything. They should be able to do that, and then we'd have an independent forecast. And then we could say, well, this budget looks fair, at least between men and women. You know, it would show if it wasn't, and I think that's what we need to do, because I think there is an inbuilt bias really in every budget that it helps men more than it helps women.
There's a hand up there towards the back row.
Thank you. I'd like to thank you for your inspirational testimony and for your courage, because what you have done has been incredibly important to all of us, for all of us, not just for women, but for the whole of our society. I want to ask you, when you were elected in '82, there was a woman Prime Minister, and you have... yeah, kind of a woman Prime Minister. And you mentioned, I'm sure quite rightly, that she was playing the man's game. She was playing at the men's game. But she was Prime Minister for a very long time, and I can't help wondering if that didn't have some influence in at least showing the country that a woman could get to high office in politics in this country.
Well, thank you very much for your comments. And I think the thing about Margaret Thatcher is that we regarded ourselves as, on the left, as people who were pressing for women's equality. So the torture that the first woman Prime Minister should be a Conservative and Margaret Thatcher, I mean, it was like torture. But the truth is, you're absolutely right. Having a woman at the top was symbolically very important, because it stopped people saying, well, a woman couldn't do this and a woman couldn't do that, because after all, she was running the flipping country. And therefore, I think that was a very, very important breakthrough moment. But actually, beyond that, she didn't advance women. In fact, when she left the cabinet, she left an all-male cabinet. It was never part of her argument that she wanted to empower and enfranchise women and put them on an equal footing. So it was paradoxical to have somebody who was so much not part of the women's movement to become the first woman Prime Minister at the time of a burgeoning women's movement. So we used to march in the streets under banners which were saying First Lady puts women last, things like that. I mean, it was kind of, conflicted times.
There's a young woman there in the second back row. I'll take one more question after that. There's a young man in the back row, and we'll go to him last. Yes, please.
Sorry. So in your speech, you said that we shouldn't really be criticising other women within the women's movement, but isn't that kind of the way to move forward? Because we need to really develop in our kind of actions. Because say at the moment, there's a kind of changing concept of gender, and say we have trans women who should be included in women's rights and women's liberation, but there's say people with more outdated views who might wish to exclude them. So my point is that we should really be criticising each other if we wish to move forward.
I should tell you that this debate has raged here in Oxford about the women's movement being exclusionary in relation to trans women. And it is an argument that's in parts of the women's movement, and you're talking about as being in solidarity with other women, and yet we're seeing these frictions. But it is a way in which you actually get, it's through discourse and through a dialogue that you get to better results. You persuade people. Isn't it important that?
Well, I think women will always, women are not homogeneous. We'll always have different views, and we can, as you say, have a dialogue and discuss them. But I think to sort of attack each other and criticise each other and undermine each other just, is just not a good thing, and we should try and be as solidarityful as we possibly can. I mean, as far as the issue in relation to trans women is concerned, I think that the idea that we should join in the oppression of trans people, I mean, that is a terrible and wrong thing for us to be doing. So, I mean, but that's where this inequality, the hierarchy of inequalities, is so unwelcome. We had a discussion in the Joint Committee on Human Rights about freedom of speech in universities, and we had a trans woman giving evidence alongside Peter Tatchell, who's been a gay rights campaigner, and she was criticising him and saying he was privileged, and therefore actually he shouldn't be allowed to speak at universities because he was privileged. But actually he's part of fighting against the oppression of gay people and homophobia, and therefore the idea of sort of relativity between different groups who are discriminated against, I think is really unhelpful.
Last question up there in the back row. I know that Harriet's got to get back up to London. An important night with her elderly mother.
Thank you very much for talking to us today. It's been fascinating. I was listening to Jess Phillips on the Nick Robinson podcast, and I think that a lot of people are kind of interpreting her as kind of like the next you, perhaps. Not that you're going anywhere. But she kind of implied that she not necessarily resents, but was kind of put off by the fact that she has kind of been burdened as like, you're going to be the lady fighting for women's rights this generation.
Who's this person?
Jess Phillips.
Jess Phillips.
Oh, Jess Phillips, yeah.
And then she listed off all of the things that she'd also like to kind of be defined by her career. Your career has very much been defined by the women's movement, but what else do you want to kind of be? I feel like we're doing your obituary, and I'm sorry. But like, what else do you want people to kind of remember, not just kind of the equality stuff?
Well, people did say at the outset of when I came into Parliament, don't bang on about women. People will think you're narrow-minded, they'll pigeonhole you. But I basically thought, well, if I don't do it, nobody else, the men aren't going to do it. And therefore, if that's the time at which you're in and the role that you're in, somebody's got to speak up on issues about childcare and domestic violence, and it will fall to women to do that. The fact that we're doing all sorts of other things on, health and on housing and on education and on the economy, I mean, we're doing all of those things. But I think that for those of us who are part of the women's movement, the biggest, it was a massive social change in women's lives and attitudes. But actually another thing that was a massive change was ending all those years of Tory government and getting a Labour government in. I mean, we'd lost in 79, in 83, in 87, in 92, And actually, I was part of, with Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, getting Labour out of opposition and into government. And that is a very huge thing to have been part of. Part of the reason that I wrote my memoirs, though, is because I noticed when they wrote their memoirs, they didn't actually seem to have written that I was part of that as well, and that actually it was women's votes which put Labour into government and shifting that gender voting pattern.
This is still the way with women, the way history is told.
So you've got to write it yourself.
You know, there was the whole business of Ireland just being celebrated, the Good Friday Agreement, and
no mention of Mo Mowlam.
Mo was written out of the story. Anyway, I just want to say that this has been wonderful. I just want to ask you about the next thing. What about Speaker of the House of Commons?
Or Speaker, as we're calling it, as a little hint there. Well, we've got a speaker, which is John Burkham,
and he's
who is an
terrific.
Absolutely excellent speaker and very independent. You know, he makes the government come to the House to explain themselves when MPs want a minister to come. He's not, you know, he says that's part of their job, and he's very strong. He got there to be a nursery in the House of Commons. You know, when I first arrived, there was a rifle range, but there was no nursery. And he's done masses of change and's received lots of criticism for it, but I think he's been an excellent speaker. So, you know, there's no vacancy at the moment. But if there was a vacancy, I might well put myself forward.
Well, there we are. You heard it here first. You heard it here first, darling. Great, you were fabulous. You were wonderful. It was great. It was great.